Well, but maybe just a very brief comment in this whole question of sort of the millennial issues. Obviously, this kind of doomsaying does tend to increase donations. But also, I think there's a kind of a psychological feeling. If it's a great, I've read accounts of when war was declared, for example, in World War I in Europe, people were overjoyed. They weren't overjoyed 3 or 4 years later, but the day the war was declared, they were singing in the street, right? And there's a kind of a schools out feeling that I think people have when they anticipate, oh boy, the world's about to blow up. You know, that's great. You know, it's sort of like Calvin of Calvin and Hobbes, who is thrilled when an ice age nearly wipes out his little town. You know, that's fun. But the thing is, let's grow up. You know, let's grow up. We're looking for solutions to come down out of the sky. We're looking for great, spectacular miracles of some sort. I'm sorry, but it's just going to be a lot of people doing a lot of little things as well as they can. That's over quite a period of time. That's how it's going to be solved. Relatively few miracles. Miracles, I suppose, can happen, but you sure don't put your money on them.
Just start that. Go.
Well, we're here going to talk about...
No intro, just talk.
Well, one of the most important or interesting thinkers in this area is Joseph Tainter, an American scholar who published a famous book called The Collapse of Complex Societies in 1988. And been reading him lately and giving a lot of thought to what he says. And his views are complicated. First thing to point out is just this simple historical fact that there are many societies throughout history have collapsed suddenly. Societies were often very, very complex, successful for many centuries, and for unclear reasons, all of a sudden, thump, they're out of business. They collapse like a house of cards. The buildings are abandoned, their governmental structures are abandoned, the people disappear or die or move away, the agriculture is abandoned, and sometimes there's nothing but ruins left. The classic, the major example of this is ancient Rome that everybody always refers to. I've heard that there's over 100 theories as to the cause of the collapse of ancient Rome, the decline and fall of ancient Rome. So I guess Tainter is offering one more theory, add the 101st theory. But that's the first thing. Is simply some societies collapse suddenly, others don't. What's the difference? Why do the ones that collapse? Why do they collapse? Why do some others somehow manage to keep going and often in changed ways when they're subject to stresses from climate change, from soil erosion, from invasion of foreign forces and so forth? Some can survive this, some can't. What's going on? And of course, the overarching question here is the relevance to our times. I mean, are we, the modern world civilization, in danger of collapse? It's kind of ironic that as we talk about this, there seems to be a fire a block away, and the local fire department here is apparently rushing to the scene. So I hope they get it out pretty soon. Anyway. Well, the phenomenon that Tainter pointed to, and he has a lot of evidence for this, is the idea that what characterizes complex societies that collapsed, and of course the problem is the details, they differ enormously in detail. So ancient Chinese civilizations versus the Chacoans versus the Anasazi versus the Mayans versus the Romans. The details are so different. You could very easily say, oh, these things have nothing in common whatsoever. And so part of what is interesting in his theories is that there's a common dynamic, there are common cause and effect relationships when societies suffer stresses, when they collapse. And so guys, just let's cut for a second. I think we need to pay a bit more attention to this shit that's going on here. I don't know how serious this actually is. I mean, what if it gets to the hotel, you know? So no use us going down and gawking because it'll just be in the way, but so one of the most important concepts when we are talking about sustainability, about the nature of life itself, is the concept of the dissipative structure, which is a concept that was first introduced by an important scientist named Ilya Prigogine, chemist and physicist who received the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in the 1980s, but I think that many people still don't understand what the heck he was talking about. What is a dissipative structure? Well, it's a very, very general concept. It comes out of a subject called non-equilibrium thermodynamics, which is the study of heat and energy in conditions that are very, very far from being all smoothed out and equilibrated and settled down. So you have strong flows of energy in material. Energy is trying to flow from one point to another. And it could be flowing as radiant energy. It could be flowing in the form of a liquid, solids, gases, plasmas, all kinds of things could be dissipative structures. And the really interesting thing about dissipative structures is that when you get these strong forms of energy, at certain points, you get nonlinearities kicking in, and all of a sudden, a stable structure forms, a highly stable structure, which is far from equilibrium.
Too jargony. It's good. It makes sense, but it's too complex.
Well, Evan, again, this is not for, okay, I guess the trouble I have is I don't find that too difficult, but It's a bit. Well, okay, the problem was I brought in the concept of equilibrium. I'll leave that out because that is another 3-minute discussion in itself. What is equilibrium? To me, it's obvious. A lot of people won't know that. So that was my mistake there. I should have not talked about the idea of this being non-equilibrium thermodynamics. That jargon was not needed because I can explain the idea without needing that. See what I'm saying? Looks like they got the fire out, which is good news. Okay. Did you want to try again?
You don't need to.
Oh, you're still running, right? Okay. One of the most important concepts in this whole discussion of sustainability and the nature of life itself is the concept of so-called dissipative structure, which was studied in great depth by a famous scientist named Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in the 1980s. And even though he achieved a lot of recognition, I still think that people don't really understand what the heck he was talking about. The mathematics of this is very difficult, but the idea is very simple. You have a powerful flow of energy. It's a very, very general idea. So some source of energy, it could be the sun, it could be nuclear reactions, it could be squirrels running in a cage, but you have some kind of source of energy. It could be water flowing down a hill or something like that. And if it's flowing fast and flowing powerfully, what happens is that at a certain point, all of a sudden, it forms a stable structure. A good example is the little whirlpool in your bathtub. When you let the plug out of your bathtub, that's a dissipative structure. A tornado is a dissipative structure. But a living organism, like a human body, is a dissipative structure. So what keeps me alive is this flow of energy, this very generous flow of energy as my body metabolizes the food that I've eaten and keeps me going. Now, simple way to example of a dissipative structure is the so-called tornado in a bottle. And you can buy this from online science stores or something. So you get two 2-liter pop bottles, plastic pop bottles. You tape them together with duct tape or something at the neck, and you have one of them full of water. Now, if you just turn it over and let the water flow through, the water flows through in a what's called turbulent form. It just sort of burbles through rather inefficiently. It takes I've done this. It takes, I think, between 9 and 12 seconds for the water to kind of turbulently flow through. Okay, now, if you do the same thing again, pick up the bottle with the water and turn it up, and just as you pick it up, give it a good spin like that. So you create a whirlpool in the water, a little bathtub vortex in the water, and that water will shoot through the nozzle in 2 to 3 seconds. So, first of all, it illustrates an example of a very easy to see example of a dissipative structure, and secondly, it gives you an idea why they occur. That dissipative structures allow nature to disperse excess energy more efficiently, more quickly. Now, the concept of dissipative structures applies to complex human societies as well. Human society, as Tainter correctly points out, is, among other things, it's a physical structure. And it's a structure that is maintained by flows of energy in abstract. Now this energy takes different forms for different societies. In an agrarian society like ancient Rome, it's primarily the form of food. Food for people, food for their draft animals, their horses, their oxen. The ancient Romans used oxen for all kinds. They used oxen the way we use tractors. So you need a lot of food, and Rome was actually 90% agrarian as its energy source. Anyway, you have to have lots of energy to maintain a complex society, and a complex society is a dissipative structure, like the human body, like a tornado. So thinking of this in very abstract and general terms. And again, like the tornado, when conditions get to a certain point, bang, the tornado suddenly appears. When the energy flow decreases steadily, at a certain point, bang, the tornado disappears. You've got to have that certain energy flow because it's a discontinuous process when these structures appear. So this could be another way of thinking about the collapse or the creation of complex societies. You get an energy flow going, of course it's got to be combined with other things. And what those are is a good question. And bing, all of a sudden, complex society may start to grow. And then if the energy flow trickles off till it gets below a certain critical point, bang, all that complexity suddenly can't be supported and the complex structure just dissipates. Bing, just like that. So here's a point where I actually disagree with Dr. Tainter. Very smart man, but I think he's wrong about this, or a little bit wrong, because he rejects the analogies between complex societies and biological organisms. He calls that mysticism. I think he's not quite right. It is much more scientific than he realizes, because a complex society itself, in abstract, is a dissipative structure like an organism. And it has the same needs as an organism. A rich flow of energy to maintain its complex activities. Well, anyway, sorry, I sort of fizzled out there. I didn't have a good ending on that, but let's say that's a cut. But
So why not you right now?
do you want to do the snap again, or just walk into it? Well, okay, let's talk about EROI a little bit. EROI is a term.
Do you need to snap again?
No, I messed up at one point. Like, I'm just noticing now that when I do, I need to be careful, because if this cord hits this metal in a certain way, it's just really loud.
Well, again, that should be
So is that?
that should be taped, right? Yeah, I think I'm done with this now, and we are coming along. You got that? Well, I've got, because we at least another 10 minutes. Do you want to just, let's do a snap and start this one all over again. When you guys are ready? Go.
Yeah.
Take 3. Okay, let's talk about the concept of EROI, energy return on energy investment. And the idea is very, very simple. In order to generate energy, useful energy, in any way, shape, or form, now whether you're pumping oil, running a nuclear reactor, collecting firewood when you're camping, growing agricultural products, which of course converting sunlight into useful energy for us. Any system at all that we use to generate energy requires the expenditure of some energy to do it. If I'm going to collect firewood, I have to walk around in the woods and collect the firewood and carry it back, and that takes energy, right? So people have worked out a simple sort of a parameter to describe the efficiency with which you're generating energy. It's called EROI, energy return on energy investment. How many units of energy do I get back for every unit of energy I spend generating the energy? Now, to put it in concrete terms, let's compare it to oil. And this is a very useful way of thinking about it. In the good old days, when you had high quality oil in a good deposit near the surface, and you could practically just stick a pipe in the ground and jump back and the oil would shoot out, and it's all good oil that you can, relatively little refining or processing is needed, they could get EROIs of 100 or more. And what that means is that for every barrel of oil you're burning to drill the well and produce the oil, you're getting 100 barrels worth of energy back again. Now, EROI of 100 or better is great. You can build a very big civilization on an EROI of 100 or so. You can put men on the moon. The Apollo, the Apollo program, and when the guys went to the moon, that you're looking at the effect of high EROI civilization. Now, the problem is, now we'll just comparative figures, a really well-run agricultural system that's just humming along and not using too much extraneous input of energy from fossil fuels and stuff, can have EROIs of 20 or better. That's pretty good. Solar power, wind power, I'm not sure. They're not spectacular, but they're good. Natural gas, 80 or so. Coal can be as high as 80 or so. These are all very competitive EROIs. Remember, EROI doesn't say anything at all about how efficiently you use the energy source that you produce. So you might produce some, I don't know, gasoline at an EROI of 100 and go, yeah, I've done really well here. And then you might go waste the gasoline on something really stupid. And so that it doesn't say anything at all about the efficiency with which you use the resource. It's just it's the inescapable minimum energy cost that you had to pay to get it. Now, one of the problems now is that throughout the world, most of the high EROI oil sources have been burned up. There's still some pretty good ones here and there, particularly in the Middle East, but we are gradually using them up. And so we're going to lower and lower EROI sources. The worst examples that I'm aware of are the tar sands, for example, in Alberta. Depending on the exact process they use, they get from 1.5 to maybe 5. That's pathetic. Remember, the ancient Romans had EROI between 20 and 30 by growing alfalfa. All right, so if all we were concerned with was producing energy, we wouldn't dream of exploiting the tar sands. It's virtually a net loss. So now, why do they still exploit the tar sands? Because it allows us to produce liquid fuels. And liquid fuels are something that the cheapest way to produce them still is to get them out of the ground, refine and crack the oil. And so that's one of the stopping points here in moving to more sustainable or renewable sources of energy is the need to produce liquid fuels to drive things like cars, airplanes, and so forth. Okay, that's a cut because I got to flip the chicken. Okay. How did that come out?
Can I climb the mountain? I can't even stand. Just hold on to me as if you can. You got lots of bullets, you just don't have a gun. promise I make, I cannot keep. But high up in the mountain, I don't even care. It looks the same as long as I don't stare. After all the talking, everyone goes home. Tomorrow's here. I'm glad I slept alone.
Possible, because to know where you're going, you have to have a sense of possibilities. Now, the thing that sometimes concerns me is that within many the writings and activities of many environmentalists, many very prominent environmentalists, we're always talking about let's do less damage to nature, let's back off, let's stop doing what we're doing. And there's a lot of justice and truth to those recommendations. but one sometimes does not see any aim beyond that. Is there any positive steps we could take? Or,
Right.
or should we just sort of stop being human beings and just go to the moon or something?
Leave the world alone.
Yeah.
And so you're suggesting that while the environmentalists are always advocating doing less harm to the system, they don't in turn have an alternative for how we could do more good to the system.
Sometimes, and some will explicitly say that we shouldn't even try, that's just human arrogance. We're just being, the whole problem is arrogance, and we should, but I think that we're in a situation where, well, let's put it this way, the opposite pole to arrogance is irresponsibility. And the truth has to lie somewhere in the middle.
Yes.
And
Nice some middle ground.
And you know, I think it's unfortunate that we've done all the damage we've done, but here we are, there's 5.7 billion or so of us, you know, and a limited amount of time. And I think that the issue now is to say, what positive good could we do? Which, in principle, is first to say, okay, some kind of symbiosis may be possible. So we have to direct human activities to rebuilding the environment, not just taking the bricks down. Of course, we have to keep ourselves alive at the same time, which is what makes it so difficult.
And this is where this topic comes in that's been much discussed in the last 8 or 10 years about sustainable development.
That's right, yeah. In 1987, the famous Brundtland Commission, sponsored by the United Nations, issued a call for what they call sustainable development, which has sort of become the buzzword in environmental circles now. It's defined as development that can, economic development, which can meet the needs of the present generation, but without compromising the ability of the future to meet their needs.
So without being so rapacious and parasitic on the future.
Well, one of the problems with the definition of the Brundtland's definition of sustainability is that because it's partially a political statement, it's a little bit vague. There's some serious ambiguities in it. Many people have criticized it on the grounds that it's sort of like saying you want to have your cake and eat it too. So-called oxymoron, you know, contradiction in terms like military intelligence or something.
Right. In other words, keep eating the cake and yet leave the cake sitting there.
That's right.
Too,
yeah.
Which doesn't make a lot of sense.
It sure doesn't. So that's the problem. How do you take care of people? Because we have a billion or more people in the world now who don't even have the basic necessities of life. I mean, we're sitting here complaining because our VCR can't record 3 tapes at once or something like that. And there's people who don't even have clothes on their back. So how do you solve that problem? And yet at the same time starting to put some of those bricks back up again. You want to feed something back into the system, and that's a very difficult problem. Now,
I certainly don't have a set of recipes. It seems to me that the direction one would go in the first place is to start to look at land reclamation projects, soil rebuilding, reforestation, things like that. If you look at the amount of time and money and effort that's devoted to things like this now, sure, there's a fair bit of it that goes on, but it's a very minor aspect of human economic activity compared to military activity, for example.
Yes.
Worldwide defense so-called defense, quote-unquote, expenditures run in the order of $1 trillion a year.
Yes.
Okay, give or take a couple $100 billion. I mean, varying from.
Whereas projects like land reclamation and so on are still spoken of as oddities and put on the human interest page and so on.
Exactly, and it seems to me that if land reclamation, things like that, were sort of a major focus of economic activity, if we put even half as much into that as we put into highway building, let alone defense expenditures, first of all, you're going to employ lots and lots of people who are sitting around with nothing to do right now, and employ them in possibly very fulfilling ways. Secondly, you're going to start putting some bricks back up again, maybe stabilize some of the climatic breakdown that we're experiencing, maybe save a few species, hold on to some of the loss of biodiversity. Things like this can be done. It just takes a bit of imagination to get it going.
Right, so that your suggestion for a definition of symbiosis is giving us an opportunity to look at it in a new way.
Well, that's what I'm hoping, is the idea that you can say, well, okay, first of all, let's get it clear that it is perhaps in principle physically possible, because what you'll find within many critics, many environmentalists, is a view that it's not even physically possible. It's not even conceivable to think of the human species as contributing positively. We're always going to be a drain on the system, and there are some who've basically said that. We're always going to be a drain, so the only question is to be as little a drain as possible. Now that's pretty hard to sell. You can't, and so you get on the one extreme people like this who say, okay, we're always going to be a drain, and then you get the sort of the sort of market-oriented types who say, hey, it's no problem, the market can solve all problems, all we need is more technology and better striped toothpaste and everything. And there has to be some middle ground on that, you see.
Okay, well, Ken, thanks very much for being on our show and explaining this. I think it is an interesting new way to look at this, and I'm quite enthusiastic about it, actually. My guest has been Kent Peacock from the University of Western Ontario Department of Philosophy. I'm your host, Peter Jedicke from Fanshawe College School of Technology, and you've been watching Search Research. Until the next episode, thanks very much for watching. So long.
Community 13 would like to hear your response to the previous program. Call the Community 13 response line at 672-1313 to have your comment recorded. That's 672-1313 for the Community 13 response line.
Body Break with Hal Johnson and Joanne McLeod.
Countryline dancing is one activity that's really grown in popularity, and you don't even need to be a cowboy or a cowgirl to join along. From community centers to recreation facilities, there are plenty of places to learn and have fun.
There's so many benefits from doing this. You can get together with friends, let the music release stress, improve your muscles, and feel good that you've learned a new activity. It's all part of how being active can improve your health and the quality of your life.
Being active is fun when you do things you enjoy. It's a matter of thinking about what you like to do and how you can easily incorporate it into your life. Being active is a natural high, and if you choose something you enjoy, it's never considered work, boring, or something only others can do. Being active can also involve helping your community, such as walking dogs for your local animal shelter or cleaning up a local park.
And you can build on the benefits of being active by adding a variety of lower-fat foods more often.
So come on and participate. All you can do is have fun. Until next time, eat well, be active, and feel good about yourself. That's vitality.
Body Break.
Providing the finest in community programming, this is Community 13, London.
Welcome to Perspective. I'm Bill Paul, and on today's show, we're going to talk about Father's Day. Something you can do on Father's Day for Dad, and that's take him out and get him stuffed.
Well, had a most interesting conversation with our guide this morning, and I can't reproduce everything he says, and some things I probably even shouldn't reproduce, even if I remember them perfectly. But one of the questions I asked was, when is the first human contact or the first human visitation to these islands? And his view, which is based partially on archaeological studies and partially on oral traditions, is that it goes back a lot farther than most of the experts say. It could be as long as 3,000 years ago. And that's not just speculation, because they found, he said, ants on remains of ants in archaeological sites. And the only way they could have gotten to the island was brought in wood or some other material carried by people in canoes. So, and there are human remains that have been found here, which are not necessarily Polynesian. Apparently they found a set of bones that from some individual who was perhaps 6'5" in height. And well, perhaps a tall Polynesian, you never know, but they're, according to our friend here, there is apparently some evidence that possibly the Chinese and the Norsemen even visited here. I mean, they did go almost everywhere in their long history. It's not out of the question, even if it's not sort of officially accepted yet. So how did they get here? How did they know to come here? Well, one of the things they did was follow the migrations of birds. So the birds flew to the island, often over vast distances, and the people of other islands further to the west learned to track the motions of birds to know where land was. And they observed that birds were flying to some point in the east, and so eventually they tracked the birds and found the island. At least that seems like a very reasonable story. So what is, you know, these things illustrate the uncertainty of our knowledge and the the richness and depth of what there is to be found out yet. I don't find it daunting. I find it stimulating, exciting, exhilarating to think that there's more that we don't know. Every now and then you read that the astronomers have decided that the universe is another 10 billion light years bigger than they thought it was last week. And that doesn't freak me out. I just go, that's really cool. That's really neat. I like elbow room. A few hundred billion light years is it's nice physical elbow room, and it's good intellectual elbow room. Lots of room for interesting things here and out there. I don't agree with the Blaise Pascal, 17th century philosopher and mathematician, who talked about what he called the horror vacui, the fear of empty spaces, the fear of just being in this vast universe. Because of course in those days they were just beginning to have some sense of how big the physical universe actually was. It wasn't just sort of a glass sphere a short distance above the surface with little lights called stars put there by the gods to amuse us. It's gigantic empty space, and this was just beginning to be realized in Pascal's time, and he was terrified by it. He sort of had, I guess, agoraphobia. It's the fear of being in open spaces. It's like an intellectual agoraphobia that some people have. And Pascal, who was a very smart man, had it in the worst way. Well, I don't feel that way. I feel sort of exhilarated by knowing how big it all is here. And the fact that we come here to this amazing place and oh, we learn that, oh, there's much more to it than you've read before, and there's many stories that only it's only can be found in the oral tradition or in the latest scientific research, and that doesn't bother me. I think, wow, that's neat. That's really interesting. That headland is really dramatic, eh? You don't mind that spider right there. Would I ever kid you about anything as important as that? It's not a very big spider. It's like, I'd say about 3 inches across. It's not, it's gone now. As John Woods used to say, don't try and kid a kidder, right? Okay, how am I doing for sound? Can you hear me okay? Well, the story is that around about 1950, Enrico Fermi and some other scientist friends were sitting around a lunch table one day after a hard morning in the lab, and they got talking about UFOs, flying saucers, which were all in the news in those days. And think about Fermi. He was a super genius, Nobel Prize, of course, contributions to particle physics, theory of beta decay, a whole lot of contributions to nuclear physics. But one of his particular skills was back-of-the-envelope estimates. He was really, really good at sort of guesstimating. For example, he supposedly once correctly estimated the number of piano tuners in the city of Chicago from first principles. So they got chatting about UFOs, and Fermi, sort of on the back of a napkin or something, worked out the probability that Earth should have been visited by aliens by now, or by then, that we should have been visited at some point by aliens. And you can sort of figure in things like the number of stars there are in the galaxy, and the number of those stars that probably have planets similar to ours, and the distance between the stars. So there's sort of an equation that a lot of people have played around with it. And if anything, the argument is even stronger now, because since then, since 1950, of course, astronomers have actually discovered well over 1,000 exoplanets, and they think there could be literally 1 billion or more Earth-like planets in our galaxy alone. So anyway, Fermi does his back-of-the-envelope magic and comes up with the conclusion that, well, it's a virtual certainty that aliens must be among us now, or should have arrived. So that gives rise to what's called Fermi's question, or sometimes Fermi's paradox, which is simply, okay, where the heck are they? I'll tell you my own solution to the Fermi paradox, jocular solution, which is to observe that, even if Fermi was right, and even if there's a virtual certainty that intelligent life would have evolved on other worlds by now, or at least it was biologically possible, it's very unlikely that this would have happened on the same worlds where coffee evolved. So the chance of having a world with intelligent life and with coffee is very small. And advanced civilization is obviously impossible without coffee. So therefore, E.T. doesn't have his morning coffee or her morning coffee, so that's why they're not here. Well, anyway, not a serious theory. But the question is actually a serious question. It's fun to think about, But it's actually a serious question because it is a virtual certainty that there should be other beings here by now. And if they're not here, why not? And what that tells us is there's something very, very important about the nature of life, about the conditions for survival, about what goes on in the universe. There's something very, very important that we don't know. And that's why the Fermi's question, even though it's just kind of for fun, is actually a very serious question if you get right down to it. And if they're not here, why not? Well, that tells us there's something important that we don't know. Life's kind of like that, isn't it?
Why do you have a bandage on your head?
Why do I have a bandage on my head? Because yesterday I made a momentary mistake. Stood up too fast when we were coming out of the cave and bonked my head on an overhanging rock. And I got a nasty gash in my scalp, which bled spectacularly and horrified everybody. I swore spectacularly. But I seem to still be okay, so we press on. Yeah, I know, I've just been warned to take it easy around horses. The cows are slow and stupid. The horses might just suddenly decide to move fast. So spooky action, what does that actually mean? And the simplest interpretation of spooky action, the most obvious thing that just jumps right at you, is that when you have these distant particles and they're somehow, their actions are correlated in these mysterious ways that violate locality, the simplest explanation is that there is actually some kind of call it a force, an energy, some kind of physical influence that is linking these two things, even though it would have to be going faster than the speed of light for that to be possible. And the trouble with that is that even though it's the most obvious explanation, it certainly upset Einstein's belief that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. It upsets, it makes physicists feel sort of like they're not doing physics anymore, that it has become, well, spooky, that it's some kind of magic or ESP or you know, something that they don't want to believe in. You know, one physicist wrote an article, guy said that, you know, I don't believe in spooks and ghosts and ESP and things like that. This affair with Bell's theorem has shaken me to the core. So this is something that's gone almost beyond just being a technical question in physics. It's a philosophical, like almost a religious question, like is non-locality possible in our world? And if it is, how do we cope with it? I mean, do we all just sort of go crazy? I mean, I've had people who know a lot about this tell me that, you know, if non-locality is real, somehow the whole world is irrational in some way. You know, that just we'll all have to start wearing clown suits with big red noses, and nobody wants that. Nobody wants to do that. So what's going on? So if you look at the history of this debate, spooky action was discovered really by the late 1920s. It was, well, actually Einstein had inklings of it even well before then. But because Einstein was always a couple of steps ahead of everybody else in those days. But if you look at the history from that point onward, I mean, and not being entirely fair, but it can be characterized as just a continuous effort by very, very clever people to blow off the whole question of non-locality. Find any other way of understanding quantum mechanics than allowing non-locality. Anything but non-locality. That's sort of been the motto of most people who have worked on trying to understand the foundations of quantum mechanics really since the late 1920s. Now, there's one outstanding exception to that, and that's the great American thinker David Bohm. Bohm did some calculations and showed that, in fact, quantum mechanics does seem to imply the existence of something he called the quantum potential, which is a mysterious, non-local sort of, call it a force field, a potential actually, which could, in fact, account for these strange correlations of quantum mechanics. Now, even Bohm, at the end, lost his nerve and tried to end up with arguing for locality in certain respects. But still, Bohm was, what Bohm did, and it's very important to realize that when Bohm proposed the quantum potential, he wasn't making it up. It's not like he just sort of said, oh, well, you know, if I could write an equation for a sort of mysterious force, that would explain all these strange correlations. No, what Bohm actually did was he just rewrote the existing equations of quantum mechanics, Schrodinger's equation, and a couple of other things, and in a certain way that simply revealed the quantum potential is actually there. It's actually built into the structure of quantum mechanics. And if you do certain kinds of calculations, it just jumps out in your face. So he wasn't even making anything up. It's just that, hey, ladies and gentlemen, there it is, right? So Einstein himself did not like Bohm's solution. It was rejected almost by virtually every other physicist in the world. J. Robert Oppenheimer said, and I think this was disgraceful, said, if we cannot refute Bohm, we must choose to ignore him, and which I don't think is very creditable to Oppenheimer. And so there it's, and really it still sort of stands there today. In 1964, Bell wrote this very fundamental paper, sort of showing that, in fact, quantum mechanics is non-local, that you cannot the only way you could possibly explain the correlations is by some kind of non-local effect, if anything. Then by about the early 1980s, a number of experimenters had shown that Bell's predictions were correct, and people were very, very upset about that. But we're still in the position today where most physicists, or many, many physicists, I mean those who are willing to even think about this, will say, oh yeah, quantum mechanics is still local, so don't worry about it. And a lot of them just don't understand Bell's theorem. A lot of them just don't think about these issues too much because they feel that it's sort of threatened their career or something like that, because it's a very tricky issue. But hey, I'm a philosopher. I'm allowed to be crazy. So I've been thinking about this for a long time, and when you actually study, well, maybe I'm going to have to get just a little bit more technical here. So what is an entangled state?
Well, what does this have to do with Easter Island?
What does this have to do with Easter Island? Well, what this has to do with is this whole issue that in order for us to survive in the world, we have to understand the world, the physics. Now, it's not the only thing we have to understand, but it's a necessary condition for our survival, that we have to understand how things work, or we'll end up, our civilization will collapse and a lot will be lost. So now, the particular relevance of this, of non-locality and entanglement and all these things, is that even though these things were discovered, as I say, almost 100 years ago, to some extent we have literally blown off the most important part of it. Because we find it, people have found it philosophically uncomfortable to talk about. They have tried to take non-locality and put it in a little box and sort of pretend that it's not really there, or if it is really there, it's not all that important. We know how to deal with it. And my view is that this is an extremely important part of our attempt to understand how the world works, and we have not dealt with it. And it could have survival implications. How do we know that we can't use non-locality in other ways that presently we're not allowing ourselves to think about? So, see, one of the things I'm looking for is, okay, so right now we're in trouble in the world, okay, so for a whole bunch of reasons, and we'll talk climate, energy, etc.